On April 20th, 2020, a barrel of oil was worth negative $37.63, not $37, negative $37, meaning if you owned a barrel of crude, you had to pay someone almost $40 just to take it off your hands. It was the first time in recorded history that the price of oil went below zero, and the place where it happened, the physical location where the contracts had to be settled, where the tanker trucks had to back up to a storage vat and deliver actual petroleum, was a town of 8,000 people in Payne County, Oklahoma, 69 miles northeast of Oklahoma City. Cushing, a place most Americans have never heard of, and yet a place that every single trading day sets the benchmark price of crude oil for the entire Western Hemisphere. Every barrel of West Texas Intermediate, the grade against which North American oil is priced, is delivered on paper and often in fact to Cushing. More than 300 storage tanks ring the town, holding over 90 million barrels of capacity, the largest crude oil tank farm on Earth, a world record. And inside that ring of steel and petroleum sits a downtown of aging brick buildings, a movie theater that charges $3 a ticket, and a 7-story hotel that was converted into senior housing decades ago. From the air, the tanks are enormous, white cylinders arrayed in precise rows, covering more acreage than the town itself. The oil that passes through Cushing in a week is worth more than everything the town's residents own combined, many times over. This is the story of how that happened. The land that would become Cushing was Sac and Fox territory, part of a reservation carved out of what had been Creek Nation holdings after an 1866 treaty with the federal government. For years, the rolling grassland served mostly as grazing land for the Michigan-owned Turkey Track Ranch, which ran cattle across thousands of acres from a headquarters 11 miles north. Then came the land run. On September 22, 1891, the Sac and Fox Reservation was opened for white settlement, and a man named William Little, everyone called him Billy Ray, staked his claim on a site he'd been eyeing for months. Little had been a government trader for the tribe and knew the ground as well as anyone alive. He built a house, laid out town lots, and waited for a town to form around him. A post office was established on November 10, 1891. The town was named not for Little, but for Marshall Cushing, the private secretary to U.S. Postmaster General John Wanamaker, a man who, as far as anyone can tell, never set foot in Oklahoma. For the first decade, Cushing was a cotton town, a small one. 4 cotton companies set up operations, which sounds impressive until you learn that by 1900, the population had reached exactly 226 people. There were 2 grain elevators, 3 lumber yards, 5 hotels, which gives you a sense of the optimism to population ratio, 8 general stores, 6 blacksmith shops, and 5 saloons. Most of the buildings stood along Main Street in a tidy row of frame structures. The economy ran on cotton farming and not much else. A quiet place, a minor place, a town so small that a single night's act of entrepreneurial audacity could literally move its center of gravity. Then the railroads arrived, and the first hint of the chaos to come with them. The Eastern Oklahoma Railway, a division of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, built a line to Cushing in 1902. The new depot wasn't on Main Street. It was about a half-mile away. This was a problem, because in a small town, whoever controlled the depot controlled the commerce. On the night of September 13, 1902, the town postmaster, Jacob Puckett, and a man named Lawrence Hay, who'd opened a new subdivision near the depot, decided to settle the matter with direct action. They loaded the frame post office building onto skids and dragged it, in the dark, from Main Street to their new addition near the tracks. The street that now had both the depot and the post office was rechristened Broadway. A new Cushing began. The following year, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, the Katy, built its own line in. By 1910, the town had grown to 1,072 inhabitants. It was a real place now, a small agricultural town with rail service, and a downtown, and churches, and a future that appeared to involve cotton and cattle and not much else. And then Tom Slick came to town. Thomas Baker Slick was born on October 12, 1883, in Shippenville, Pennsylvania, in the heart of the state's original oil country. He arrived in Oklahoma Territory in 1904, hired by a man named Alexander Massey of the Spurlock Petroleum Company. Massey had drilled 25 consecutive successful wildcat wells in Kansas and wanted Slick to secure leases for him in Oklahoma. Slick was good at leasing, very good, but the wells that followed were not. Massey ran out of money at a depth of 2,800 feet and gave up. Slick moved on. He drilled in Kentucky, western Canada, and eventually circled back to Oklahoma. For years he found nothing but dry holes, so many that the oil field men started calling him Dry Hole Slick. Some called him Mad Tom. He didn't stop. In the winter of 1911, Slick arrived in the Cushing area with his partner, Charles B. Schaefer, and began buying up leases with a quiet, almost feral intensity. The local newspaper, the Cushing Democrat, urged its readers to deal with him. Slick and Schaefer eventually secured leases on more than 27,000 acres of surrounding farmland, much of it purchased for 65 cents to $1 an acre from farmers who had no idea what was underneath them. One of those farmers was Frank Wheeler, who'd bought his land, situated on allotments previously held by Creek Indians, for about 65 cents an acre just before statehood in 1907. On March 12, 1912, Slick's drill bit hit the Wheeler sand at a depth of 2,300 feet on the Wheeler farm, 12 miles east of Cushing. The well came in at 400 barrels a day. Slick did something remarkable. He kept it secret. He roped off the well, posted armed guards, and for almost 2 weeks he and Schaefer leased every surrounding property they could get their hands on. When a rival leaseman telephoned his boss to report the strike, the story was already over. As the man recounted, he'd heard about the discovery on a party line, rushed to the livery stable to hire a rig to go leasing, and discovered that Slick had already been there and hired every rig in town. Every single one. When word finally got out, what followed was one of the most violent, lucrative, and anarchic oil booms in American history. The Cushing Drumright oil field, as it came to be known, covered 32 square miles across 3 counties. Of the first 46 wells drilled after the Wheeler strike, only 1 proved dry. Cushing, the nearest town with rail service and banking, became the supply center and refining hub virtually overnight. People poured in, millionaires and criminals, roughnecks and hobos, leasemen and whiskey peddlers. Oklahoma was officially a dry state, but in the first week of the boom, liquor sellers appeared on every corner doing a brisk business. Oil workers earned $6 to $15 a day, extraordinary wages for 1912, and they spent it as fast as they earned it. Restaurants, hotels, barber shops, and illegal saloons kept open house on both sides of Broadway late into the night. Down at the freight yards, men sweated to load wagons with pipe, steam boilers, lumber, and wire. Workers rented rooms in shifts. When the rooms were full, men slept in chairs, in hallways, on pool tables. An estimated 276 wagons ran daily between Cushing and the oil fields. Out in the countryside, dirt roads that had carried nothing heavier than a hay wagon were suddenly choked with flashy automobiles driven by agents offering fistfuls of cash for drilling rights. Farmers who had never seen $100 in one place were being offered thousands for a signature on a lease. The first boom peaked and nearly died within 18 months. Then, on November 30th, 1913, the Prairie Oil and Gas Company hit a deeper formation, the Bartlesville Sand, at 2,600 feet, and brought in a massive producer. Many wells in this new horizon came in at 8,000 barrels a day or more. The boom reignited, hotter than before. In January 1915, yet another pay horizon was discovered in the northern part of the field, producing around 10,000 barrels per well. By May 1915, the Cushing Drumright Field had reached its peak. 3,090 active wells pumping 310,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. To put that in perspective, that was roughly 1/3 of the entire nation's daily oil consumption at the time, from one field in one corner of Oklahoma. Cushing itself was transformed. The population had rocketed from about 1,000 to estimates of 15 or 20,000 at the peak of the frenzy. Some accounts say higher, though exact figures are impossible to pin down in a place where people were arriving and leaving by the hundred every week. 23 oil companies set up operations in town. 5 oil field supply houses opened. The Consumers Oil Company built Cushing's first refinery in 1913, and over the years that followed, more than 50 refineries would operate in and around the town. 10 natural gasoline plants were built. Pipelines radiated outward in every direction. Reportedly, there had been just one automobile in Cushing at the time of Slick's discovery. Within 2 years, the roads were choked with them. The Cushing Drumright Field, by 1919, had produced 236 million barrels of oil and accounted for 17% of all the oil produced in the United States, and roughly 3% of total world production. In 1914, it became the first field in the country to produce more than 1 million barrels in a single year. By the early 1920s, annual production topped 12 million barrels. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission, alarmed at the scale of waste, issued Order Number 829 on July 1, 1914, the state's first oil and gas conservation regulation. It was largely ignored. Oil gushed into open earthen pits and flowed unchecked into creeks. Natural gas was vented or flared. The urgency was production, production, production. Nobody was thinking about 20 years from now. Nobody had to. Around the oil field, instant towns sprouted with names that told you everything about the era's mood. Drumright, Oilton, Shamrock, where the streets were named Tipperary and Cork and the buildings painted green, and a string of camps called Dropright, Gasright, Allright, Downright, Damright, and Just Right. Most of them would not survive the decade. Bodies turned up in oil storage tanks and oil-choked creeks. Violence was casual and frequent. Cushing was no gentle place, but it was the one town in the field with banks, with rail, with the bones of a real community underneath the chaos. And even in those wild years, Cushing was quietly producing something besides oil. In 1921, the town was prosperous enough to establish a country club with an 18-hole golf course, the kind of amenity that signaled the community's confidence in its own future. 2 years later, in 1923, a 20-year-old kid named Carl Hubbell, fresh off a job as a roustabout for an oil company near Meeker, Oklahoma, a town of 300 about 30 miles south, got a tryout with the Cushing Refiners, the town's Class D minor league baseball team. Manager Ned Pettigrew liked what he saw and signed him. Hubbell had a funny pitch, a reverse curve he threw by snapping his wrist inward, making the ball dive away from right-handed batters. It was called a screwball. Within 5 years, he'd be pitching for the New York Giants. In 1934, at the All-Star game in the Polo Grounds, Hubbell would use that same pitch to strike out 5 consecutive future Hall of Famers: Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin, in what became one of the most legendary moments in baseball history. He'd go on to win 253 games, earn 2 Most Valuable Player awards, and enter the Hall of Fame in 1947. His professional career began in Cushing, on a diamond near the railroad crossing, in a town that smelled like crude. As for Tom Slick, Dry Hole Slick, Mad Tom, the king of the wildcatters, his Cushing discovery was only the beginning. He expanded into fields across Oklahoma: Pioneer, Tonkawa, Papoose, Seminole, and eventually the Oklahoma City field itself. By 1929, he was considered the largest independent oil operator in the United States, with a net worth estimated between $35 million and $100 million. The range is wide because Slick, intensely private, never disclosed his exact holdings. He diversified into railroads, townsite development, and plantations. His business partner, Charles Urschel, would later be kidnapped by George Machine Gun Kelly and held for ransom, a story that led to one of the FBI's most famous manhunts. And then on August 16, 1930, Slick died of a stroke. He was 46 years old. Biographers have suggested that the cumulative stress of his relentless drive to build and expand contributed to his early death. Every pump jack in the vast Oklahoma City oil field stood silent for 1 hour in tribute. 1 week later, in a coda almost too perfectly American to be real, his Campbell No. 1 well in the Oklahoma City field, the well he'd been working on when he died, came in at 43,200 barrels per day, his biggest strike ever. He never saw it. He left his children approximately $15 million. His son, Tom Slick, Jr., would become a Yale-educated inventor, philanthropist, and cryptozoology enthusiast who founded the Southwest Research Institute and funded expeditions to search for the Yeti and the Loch Ness Monster. He also died at exactly 46 in a plane crash over Montana in 1962. Back in Cushing, the oil was already draining away. Production peaked in 1915, and by the end of 1916 had fallen by more than half. The massive waste of the boom years, oil spilled into open earthen pits, natural gas vented into the sky, crude flowing unchecked into creeks, had robbed the field of pressure it would never recover. The flush production of 20 to 50 million barrels per year continued only through 1919, then began its long, irreversible decline. By 1955, the field produced just 6,209 barrels per day, a rounding error compared to its peak. But Cushing didn't die. Other boom towns, Shamrock, where they'd named the streets for Irish cities and painted the buildings green, Markham, Pemita, Capper, Quay, withered into ghost towns or disappeared entirely. The oil camps called Drop Right and Dam Right and Just Right vanished as if they'd never existed, which in a meaningful sense they hadn't. Cushing survived because it had never been just about pulling oil out of the ground. It was about refining it, storing it, and moving it through pipes. The town had infrastructure that outlasted the wells. The population actually kept growing after the boom. In 1920, the census counted 6,326 residents. By 1930, it reached 9,301, the largest the town would ever be. There was a country club founded in 1921. The Duncan Theater opened in 1926 and still stands today. And in 1928, more than 100 local businessmen pooled their money to build something that would announce to the world that Cushing was here to stay. The Hotel Cushing, a 7-story Art Deco tower at 214 East Broadway, designed by the Oklahoma City architectural firm Hawk and Parr. It was the tallest building in town by a wide margin, 70-plus rooms, retail on the ground floor, a parking lot in the back for the tourists and traveling salesmen. Hawk and Parr had just finished the Bess Hotel in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and had designed buildings all over Oklahoma City. The Hotel Cushing was meant to be Cushing's declaration of permanence. The oil might be declining, but the town was not going anywhere. For a while, it worked. 16 oil companies still operated in Cushing in 1930. 3 refineries remained active into the 1940s. The cumulative production of the Cushing Drumright field would eventually exceed 450 million barrels. But the population told the true story. By 1940, 1,500 residents had left. The long, slow middle of the century was kind enough. The town held around 8,000 through the 1950s and 1960s, sustained by the remaining refineries, the pipeline operations, and the general commerce of a small Oklahoma town. People raised families. Kids went to Cushing High School, played for the Tigers. The WPA built a memorial park in 1935 with a duck pond and picnic pavilions. It was a decent life, but it was a holding pattern, not a revival. The boom-era energy was gone. Then the 1970s and 1980s hit like a two-punch combination. The global oil market convulsed. Oklahoma's oil economy, never fully diversified, suffered enormously. The last two major refineries in Cushing, Kerr-McGee and Hudson, closed their doors. Rail service ended in 1982. The same railroad lines that had made the boom possible, the depot that Jacob Puckett had so desperately wanted to be near that he dragged a post office half a mile in the dead of night, was now silent. Major retail stores shuttered. Downtown Cushing, the Broadway that had blazed with light during the boom, began to empty. The Hotel Cushing was converted into apartments and renamed Cimarron Tower. Its 7 stories still rose above everything else on the street, but now the building housed seniors rather than oil men, and the storefronts on the ground floor were covered with stucco. And then something happened that no one in Cushing engineered, no one in Cushing lobbied for, and almost no one in Cushing fully understood. Something that would make their small town more important to the global economy than it had been even at the height of the boom. On January 28, 1981, the U.S. government decontrolled oil prices, ending the regulatory framework that had governed crude pricing since the 1973 Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act. Overnight, oil started trading at free market spot prices, centered on Cushing, Midland, Texas, and Houston. The volatility that followed created enormous demand for financial instruments to manage price risk. On March 30, 1983, the New York Mercantile Exchange launched its light sweet crude oil futures contract. NYMEX was, at the time, a small agricultural exchange, best known for trading Maine potato futures. It had 816 members. The crude oil contract needed a physical delivery point, a real place where, if a trader held the contract to expiration, actual barrels of oil would have to change hands. The designers chose Cushing, Oklahoma, because it was already a hub for cash market trading of crude. The network of pipelines, the remaining storage terminals, the geographic centrality, Cushing was the crossroads. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Houston or Midland, but it was connected to everywhere, and that was what mattered. The first month, NYMEX traded about 3,000 contracts. A rival contract at the Chicago Board of Trade actually did more volume initially, over 30,000 contracts in its first month. But within 6 months, the CBOT contract was dead, trading just 51 contracts a day, while NYMEX was handling more than 1,700. Analysts attributed CBOT's failure to more cumbersome delivery logistics and the oil industry's unfamiliarity with the Chicago trading floor. Within a year of launch, NYMEX monthly volume exceeded 100,000 contracts. By the end of the 1980s, it surpassed 2 million contracts per month. The WTI crude oil futures contract became the most liquid energy futures contract in the world, and every single one of those contracts pointed ultimately at Cushing. The implications of that single decision, Cushing as delivery point, are difficult to overstate. It meant that every oil producer, refiner, and trader on the continent had a financial reason to run a pipeline to or through Cushing. It meant that storage capacity in Cushing became a strategic asset of global consequence, and companies began building tank farms on the prairie around town with the same urgency that Tom Slick's Roughnecks had once drilled wells. The Shell pipeline terminal alone consisted of 39 storage tanks and could move 1.5 million barrels a day, employing about 150 workers, one of the town's largest payrolls. Other companies, Enbridge, Enterprise Products, Plains All-American, Magellan, Sunoco, Valero, Energy Transfer, built their own terminals and facilities. The Keystone Pipeline, running from Hardisty, Alberta, came through Cushing. The Seaway Pipeline from the Texas Gulf Coast came through Cushing. The Spearhead Pipeline from Flanagan, Illinois, came through Cushing. Pipes from the Permian Basin, from North Dakota's Bakken Shale, from Kansas, from Colorado, from the Mississippian Lime Play in northern Oklahoma. They all converged on the same small town in Payne County. Crude from Canada, from Texas, from the Rockies, from the Great Plains, funneled through a single point on the Oklahoma map. The sign at the corner of Main Street and South Stiles Road, fashioned out of actual pipe with a working valve, read, "Cushing, Oklahoma, Pipeline Crossroads of the World." By the early 2000s, Cushing held about 13% of total American crude oil storage capacity. The tank farms sprawled across the countryside, visible on satellite imagery as vast arrays of white circles, dwarfing the town itself. More than 300 tanks, over 90 million barrels of total capacity, a world record for the largest crude oil storage facility on the planet. Crude oil flowing inbound from every direction and outbound through dozens of pipelines. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Colombia, Ecuador, nations on the other side of the world were pricing their crude based in part on what was happening at Cushing. Cushing was no longer producing oil or refining oil in any significant quantity. What it was doing was something far stranger and more powerful. It was the physical anchor for the abstraction of price. Every barrel of WTI crude on the NYMEX, every trade, every hedge, every speculation, ultimately referred back to oil that could be delivered to a cluster of steel cylinders outside a town whose biggest employer was a private prison. That prison, the Cimarron Correctional Facility, had opened 3 miles southwest of town in 1997, operated by Core Civic. It employed more than 200 people. In a town of 8,000, that mattered. It also told you something about what Cushing's economy had become. The old refinery jobs were gone. The roughneck wages were a memory. The new employers were a private prison company, a pipeline terminal, and whatever service businesses could sustain themselves in a town that the national economy both depended on and had largely forgotten. Then came April 20th, 2020. The world was locked down. COVID-19 had shuttered economies across the globe. Global oil demand had collapsed by an estimated 30 million barrels per day, from a baseline of about 100 million down to roughly 70. Oil was still being pumped, still flowing through the pipelines, still arriving at Cushing, but nobody wanted it. Refineries were running at fractions of their capacity. Airlines were grounded. Highways were empty. The storage tanks at Cushing were filling up fast. Cushing's working capacity was about 76 million barrels across 15 terminals, and by late April, roughly 60 million barrels were already stored. Most of the remaining space had been pre-sold under long-term contracts, spoken for, unavailable. Traders who held the May 2020 WTI futures contract, the one expiring the very next day, suddenly realized they had no place to put the oil they were contractually obligated to take delivery of at Cushing. There is no dock at Cushing, no waterborne delivery option, no way to divert the oil onto a ship and send it elsewhere. You need either a pipeline allocation or a physical terminal. Storage fees for failing to take delivery could be astronomical. The math became simple and insane. It was cheaper to pay someone to take the oil than to owe the storage fees. The price plunged through the trading day, past $20, past $10, past $0. It settled at negative $37.63 per barrel. For the first and, so far, only time in recorded history, oil was worth less than nothing, a liability, not an asset. You owned it, and that was your problem. And the bottleneck that made it happen was physical, specific, and local. The finite capacity of the steel tanks surrounding Cushing, Oklahoma. A closed system with a fixed amount of storage. A town that could not absorb one more barrel. The irony is almost architectural. A town born because oil gushed out of the ground in 1912. A town where men fought and killed for the right to pump as much crude as fast as possible had become, a century later, the place where oil became a liability, where possessing it cost you money. The field that once produced 310,000 barrels a day had by this point been mostly automated, its remaining production a trickle. The 50 refineries were all gone, but the pipes and the tanks remained, and it was the pipes and the tanks, the infrastructure of movement and storage, not production, that made Cushing the place where the impossible happened. 6 months after the negative price event on November 6, 2016, I should say 4 years before, because the earthquake actually preceded the negative price event, Cushing felt the ground move in a different way. At 7:44 p.m. on a Sunday night, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck about 1 mile west of town. It was the 5th largest earthquake in Oklahoma's recorded history, felt as far away as Iowa, Illinois, and Texas. The cause was almost certainly the underground injection of wastewater left over from oil and gas production, the industry pumping its waste back into the earth, pressurizing dormant faults, making them slip. One resident described her trailer shaking so violently she thought it would tip over. The city manager said it was beginning to become normal. Nothing surprised him anymore. Downtown Cushing took the worst of it. The unreinforced masonry buildings dating from the early 1900s, the brick commercial buildings that had been the town's pride during the boom, shed their facades. Piles of rubble and broken glass covered the sidewalks. 40 residents were evacuated from Cimarron Tower, the old Hotel Cushing, after the building sustained damage. Its cast stone cornice at the roof line, part of the decorative Art Deco parapet that Hawk and Parr had designed in 1928, had to be removed because the pieces were loose and posed a falling hazard. 2 years later, the ornamentation had still not been replaced. The earthquake did not damage the tank farms. Officials confirmed there were no signs of spills or leaks. The oil infrastructure, the stuff that actually mattered to the global economy, the reason anyone outside of Payne County knew the word Cushing, came through unscathed. What broke was the town. The century-old buildings, the commercial architecture of the boom years, the physical expression of Cushing's original ambition. That's what crumbled. Some buildings were demolished. Others stood unrepaired, their brick exposed where facades had sheared away. The EERI reconnaissance team that surveyed the damage noted that the town had already been developing along the highway corridor, away from the historic downtown, before the earthquake. The quake just accelerated what was already happening. At the time of the initial survey, 27% of the downtown businesses had already relocated, closed prior to the earthquake, or were seasonally shut. The earthquake didn't kill downtown Cushing, but it made the decline visible in a way that couldn't be ignored. Brick and mortar on the sidewalk, the bones of the boom years exposed. In 2020, the same year oil went negative, CoreCivic announced it was closing the Cimarron Correctional Facility. Budgetary cuts by the Oklahoma Department of Corrections meant fewer inmates going to private prisons. The 200 jobs evaporated. And yet, the WTI contract still delivers to Cushing. The pipelines still converge. The tank farms still hold a meaningful fraction of America's strategic crude reserves. In May 2023, Cushing was selected as the site for a new $5.56 billion crude oil refinery, the first major refinery to be built in the United States in decades, designed to process 250,000 barrels per day of light sweet crude into low-carbon transportation fuels, with a goal of zero carbon footprint operation. If it opens as planned around 2027, it would create 423 direct jobs with a payroll of nearly $40 million a year and generate an estimated $18 billion in total economic impact over the following decade. Cushing, it seems, is not finished with oil. Oil is not finished with Cushing. The town that watched its last refinery close in the 1990s may yet see a new one rise, bigger and more ambitious than anything it had during the boom. The 2020 census counted 8,327 people living in town, almost exactly the same number as in the year 2000, and not far from the 8,619 who lived there in 1960. The population has been remarkably stable for more than half a century, hovering in that narrow band, while the town's economic function has transformed beyond recognition. In 1915, Cushing was a place that produced oil. In 1930, it was a place that refined oil. In 1983, it became a place that priced oil. In 2020, it was a place that stored so much oil it broke the market. The people who live there have watched their town become an abstraction, a line item in energy market reports, a pricing benchmark, a data point that traders in New York and London and Singapore check every Tuesday when the EIA releases its weekly storage numbers. The weekly Cushing inventory report moves billions of dollars in global markets. The people at the grocery store on Broadway have no more control over this than they do over the weather. The Duncan Theater, which opened in 1926 near the peak of the first oil boom, still shows movies for about $3 a ticket. It has one screen. The building's architecture, visitors say, is beautiful, a remnant of a time when even a small-town movie house was built to impress. The Copperpenny Trading Company operates out of a three-story, 22,500-square-foot building constructed in 1925. Centennial Park, in the heart of downtown, sits between two historic red brick buildings and features an old oil derrick alongside picnic tables and string lights. The Buffalo Rock Golf Course, originally the Cushing Country Club dating from 1921, remains open to the public. Cimarron Tower, the old Hotel Cushing, still stands at 214 East Broadway, still the tallest building downtown, still 7 stories of brown tapestry brick and cream-colored cast stone. The National Register of Historic Places added it to its rolls recently, recognizing it for its architectural significance. The nomination paperwork describes the building as representing the culmination of the city's ambition during the initial oil boom years. More than 100 businessmen pooled their capital to make it happen. They wanted a gathering place for residents and a comfortable stop for visitors. They wanted Cushing to have a building that said, "This is a real city." The building still says that, but its terracotta cornice has not been replaced since the earthquake of 2016, and the storefronts on the ground floor are clad in the stucco of a 1980s renovation, and the rooms upstairs house seniors instead of wildcatters, and the parking lot out back that was designed for tourists and traveling salesmen is mostly empty most days. Out past the edge of town, the tank farms stretch across the prairie. More than 300 cylindrical white tanks, arrayed in neat rows, each one capable of holding hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude. From the air, they look like coins arranged on a vast brown table. And the town itself, the grid of streets, the steeple, the 7-story hotel, is a small, incidental thing tucked between them. In a satellite image, Cushing looks like a town that wandered into the wrong field and got surrounded. The tanks are the point. The town is the footnote. Every Tuesday morning, traders around the world wait for the U.S. Energy Information Administration to release its weekly petroleum status report. The number they care about most is Cushing crude oil stocks. How many barrels are sitting in those tanks right now? If the number goes up, prices tend to soften. If it drops, prices tighten. As of early June 2026, the number has been falling, and falling fast. Cushing storage has dropped to about 21 million barrels, dangerously close to the 20 million barrel threshold, below which the system begins to fail, below which what remains is largely unusable sludge at the bottom of the tanks. 6 years after the tanks were so full that oil went negative, they are nearly empty. Tom Slick's gusher came in at 400 barrels a day on a farm where the land had cost 65 cents an acre, and it changed everything. 114 years later, the same stretch of Oklahoma ground still changes everything. Not because of what flows out of it, but because of what flows through it, and what the world has decided it means.